High Bridge is a booming little village. Within the past year, we've had at least a dozen new dwellings erected. We have 2 dry goods stores, each doing a thriving business. We have 1 drugstore and a handsome church, a blacksmith shop, a barber shop, a rock quarry, a sawmill, and 2 hotels. In all probability, High Bridge would have never been built in its present location if not for the foresight of one man, General Leslie Combs. General Combs was born in Madison County in 1793 and moved to Jessamine County in about 1812. He obtained a job in the county clerk's office as a deputy clerk. It was from here he went to the War of 1812. Combs's dream of building a railroad may have begun in Lexington in 1832. A man by the name of Thomas Barlow built a working model of a steam engine. No one in this area had ever seen such a thing. He set his little engine up on a wooden oval track in a large warehouse. His train was not much more than a big toy that pulled 1 car that held 2 passengers. For the price of 50 cents, you could take a ride around the room. One day, standing in that room was General Leslie Combs, patiently waiting to take his ride on the train. It's a good possibility that Combs' dream of building a railroad began right here. Shown here is one of the stocks sold by the Lexington Danville Railroad Company. It's dated 1854. The biggest obstacle standing in General Combs' way was how to span the Kentucky River Gorge. To solve this problem, Combs hired one of the most noted bridge builders in America, John Worthen. Worthen would go on to build a suspension bridge across the Ohio at Covington, and then later the famous Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. His company would later furnish the cables for the Golden Gate Bridge. Worthen's design for a bridge at High Bridge was to build 2 gigantic sets of towers. One was to be placed on the Mercer County side and one on the Jessamine County side. The bridge would be supported by a set of large steel cables. In this view of the towers, note the little building to the left. This was High Bridge's first depot. The towers became an instant landmark. They were known to people for miles around. Religious services and political gatherings were often held within the shadows of these towers. It wasn't long after the towers were built that the little village took on the name of North Towers. About a third of Worthen's old towers can still be seen today. The stones used to build a retainer wall on both sides of the remaining towers were taken from the top of the towers. For over 30 years, every train that crossed High Bridge came through this opening. The trains at first were small, but as the years went on, they grew larger and larger. If you had lived at High Bridge prior to 1888, you would have received your mail at North Towers, as shown here on this envelope, dated October 1, 1877. James Dorman became High Bridge's first postmaster. He opened his post office in the back of this store in 1887. The building was torn down in 2004. The first bridge was designed by John Sailor Smith, a Confederate soldier. This was a cantilever bridge, a total new concept in building bridges. It would be the first of its kind built in America. Work on the bridge had begun in 1876, and it was completed in 1877. When completed, not only was it a thing of beauty, but it was an engineering marvel. It held the distinction of being the highest bridge over a navigable stream. On September the 13th of 1879, 2 years after the bridge was completed, it was dedicated. President Rutherford B. Hayes and the famed Civil War General William Sherman attended the ceremony. The depot seemed to be the hub and the pride of the little village. Most of the businesses and dwellings had sprung up around it. It was a place where you could watch the people and freight come in and catch up on the latest news. People came to High Bridge by coach, buggy, and steamboat, but the train seemed to be the most preferred way of traveling. The first camp meeting held at High Bridge was in the summer of 1880. Tents were set up throughout the park. It was a time for relaxation and a time to escape the heat and stench of the big cities. One knew when he stepped from his tent in the morning to a view like this that he was in a very special place. It wouldn't have been hard to feel close to God and nature. There were many paths throughout the park and along the cliffs. Wildflowers grew everywhere. The tiger lily in the early spring blanketed the park, just like it does today. Two of the favorite times to visit the park was in the early spring and in the fall when the leaves were changing. Prior to building the pavilion, or the tabernacle as it was first called, services were held outside. A large tent was provided in case of bad weather. The Reverend Sam Jones made his first appearance at High Bridge Park in the summer of 1885. Prior to him coming, only several hundred people a year attended the camp meetings, but this was about to change. Sam Jones was probably the most popular and well-known preacher of his day, but Sam was not your typical preacher. He neither looked or dressed the part. Sometimes he smoked a big cigar. When you didn't catch him doing that, he was chewing tobacco. No matter where he went, he drew people by the thousands. A fellow listening to him preach one time said he made me feel like my boots were on fire. When Sam stepped upon the stage of the old pavilion, he'd start his sermon off with something like this. "You old red-nosed drunk sitting over there, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I'd rather be up here in Nicholasville, in jail, waiting to be hung, knowing I was an innocent man, than be an old red-nosed drunk like you." At this point, everyone would break out in laughter, and Sam would light in on the women. "Say, sis, don't you be laughing at these old drunks. Said you're going to go to hell with them. Said you let your daughters go out of here in these tight-fitting buggies so they don't come home almost dark. So what do you think they've been doing out there all that time?" You might think the folks at High Bridge took offense to what Sam was saying, but they didn't. They loved him. Prior to coming to High Bridge in 1885, Sam had set up his revival tent outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville at this time was a wide-open little river town. It was full of bars and gambling places. While holding his revival, Sam had an unexpected visitor. Captain Thomas Ryman owned about 35 steamboats operating the Cumberland and the Mississippi rivers. He was probably the richest man on the Mississippi. Captain Ryman just happened to dock at Nashville at the same time that Sam was holding his revival. Finding a number of bars and gambling places closed, many of which belonged to him, he became a bit angered. So he set out for the revival to give Sam a piece of his mind. But Ryman made a mistake. He stopped and listened to Sam preach. The old riverboat captain, who had been tougher than nails all his life, was converted that day. He would later tell Sam that he was going to build him the biggest tabernacle that Nashville had ever seen. Well, Ryman kept his promise to Sam and built a tabernacle. It was called Sam's Place. Sam preached 16 revivals there. When Captain Ryman died in 1904, Sam asked that the name be changed to the Ryman Auditorium. It is best known today as the home of the Grand Ole Opry. Sam Jones returned to High Bridge in the summer of 1887 and was preaching at the park. At the close of one of the sessions, he made an unusual gesture. He asked that a separate collection be taken up for the people of High Bridge so they could build a new church. The townfolk were delighted. They took their newly found fortune down to J.D. Hughes at the sawmill to purchase lumber for their new church. Hughes accepted their $46 and extended them another $200 credit to buy lumber for their church. This is how the Union Christian Church at High Bridge came to be. Shown here is another man that drew large crowds at High Bridge Park. His name was the Reverend Thomas DeWitt Talbot. He was pastor of the Brooklyn Tabernacle in New York, the largest church in America. One might wonder what he was doing preaching in High Bridge. Well, he'd come under the invitation of Sam Jones. Though different as day and night, these two men become good friends. The folks at High Bridge spent their winter months canning fruit, honey, curing hams, and making souvenirs. They had thought of everything they could do to make money. They had truly turned into a capitalist society. You could rent a horse and buggy and take your gal a ride to the countryside. Or you could rent a boat and spend a day on the river picnicking and swimming. Mr. James Cook, another enterprising person at High Bridge, who happened to be the local druggist, built a bathing beach up in Dix River. He ran a small shutter boat from the ferry landing up to his beach. Mr. Cook, being a good businessman, advertised that all the ladies had to do was produce a bathing suit to have free access to his boat and his beach, knowing good and well that the gawking eyes of the fellows would soon follow. The community seemed to come together when it came to promoting the village. They tried their best to make it entertaining for the tourists, even to the point of exaggerating sometimes. One good example was Daniel Boone's cabin. It was located right on the edge of the cliff in front of the old pavilion. They wasn't quite sure who built the cabin, but they swore that Daniel Boone laid the chimney with his own hands. Another example was the old Shaker Road that ran from the landing into Shakertown. They called it the Old Wilderness Road, as shown here on this postcard. This is a scene looking at the mouth of Dix River taken from the bridge. Note the road going up the cliff on the right-hand side. This was the old Harrodsburg-Perryville Turnpike. but not to the people in High Bridge. This was the old Buffalo Trace. To the far left, on the other side of the river, was Daniel Boone's cave. You would be told that old Daniel often used this cave when he was in the area. Another favorite attraction was these old wooden steps that was built from the park to the river bottom below. The steps had a large overlooked platform near the top. About midway down there was a landing. There was 177 steps. They caught on fire in 1948 and burned down when some fellas in the bottom were burning some hemp trash. To climb this set of stairs, you had to either be young or young at heart. The pavilion has gone by several names over the years. At first it was known as a tabernacle. It was used for religious services and religious services only, no dancing allowed. At the turn of the last century, things began to change. It was now being called the pavilion. It had a wide walkway all the way around the building. This was filled with fresh sawdust every spring. It was called the promenade. This is where the young folks gathered in their Sunday best, in an endless parade around the building, as their counterparts sat on the grass and watched. It wouldn't be unusual to see a pretty country girl walking along, shuffling her feet in the sawdust, as an old boy in a barred suit followed close behind. The pavilion was torn down in 1998. The promenade that had been boarded over was as visible as it was nearly 100 years ago. In 1905, the Queen and Crescent, a branch of the Southern Railroad, bought the park. It made several additions. One was adding a large dining room to the back of the pavilion. The Queen and Crescent was a pride of the Southern and catered mainly to the upper class, as shown here by this dining car and these brochures. Note this one, it ranked High Bridge right up there with Lexington. Nothing ever has or ever will bring the excitement to the river as did the steamboat. There was only 5 locks in the river prior to 1850. The big boats could only come up to High Bridge in what they called slack water. This mostly occurred in the winter months. It wasn't until 1891, till Lock 6 was completed near Savisa, that the big boats could come up to High Bridge year-round. Shown here is the Fall City headed back downriver under High Bridge. This was probably the largest and most well-known boat on the river. The packet boat was like a gift of the gods to the people living along the riverbanks. Here they could obtain a variety of goods that could not be found elsewhere, not even in the local towns and cities. It not only brought them a line of great products, but it also carried their stock and crops to market. It wasn't unusual to see one of these big boats pushing a barge of coal or grain up to Curry's distillery at Camp Nelson. The ferry crossing at High Bridge had been here since before the county was formed in 1798. It became known as the Upper Shaker Landing. The Shaker started operating this ferry in 1840. The story of High Bridge wouldn't be complete unless we told you about Wash Hicks. He's shown here with his fiddle, his old dog, and his wife Amanda. What more could a fellow want out of life? He lived in a little house at the mouth of Dix River on the Garrett County side. Wash was a bit of a tinker and a community blacksmith. He could build and repair just about anything. He had watched the big excursion boats come upriver with all those people dressed in those fine clothes and all that money in their pockets. So Wash decided to go into the excursion business and build himself a paddle wheel. Unlike the big boats, his paddle wheel didn't have an engine. It was operated by 2 large levers and ruddered by his foot. But nevertheless, it served Wash its purpose. He would go down to the ferry landing and pick up his passengers and start on their journey. Wash would make his way back up to Kentucky and into the mouth of Dix, pointing out sights along the way. Up in Dix River there was a big rock that Wash called the Petrified Elephant. He said the elephant had fell to his death from the cliff many centuries before. Wash would then turn his little boat around and head back down to his place at the mouth of Dix River. Here the folks were allowed to step out and stretch their legs a bit. As seen in this picture, in the back of Wash's house, you'll see an old set of rickety stairs he had built to the top of the cliff. If any of the folks were brave enough, they were invited to climb up to the top of the stairs where they could get a good view of the bridge. After lingering a bit, the folks would board the little excursion boat and head back up to Kentucky. The next stop on the tour was a famous Daniel Boone cave that they had heard so much about. Wash would tell them about the time that the Indians were chasing Boone around the top of the cliff, and he had to jump off into the top of a tall tree in order to escape. He didn't know exactly where this event took place, but he knew it was along here somewhere. If you wished, you could climb up and go inside the cave. If the truth be known, Daniel Boone was never in this cave. Water run from it much of the year, and planks had to be put down to keep people from walking in the mud. But nevertheless, the local folks believed it, and that's all that counted. After leaving Boone's cave, the little excursion party headed on upriver to Bowman's Bottom. Here they went up a small path along a branch to see the famous Yahoo Falls. The falls were not much more than shoulder high, with just a trickle of water running over, but I'm sure that Wash had a big tale to tell about them. This ended the tour, and everybody boarded, headed back downriver to the landing. There would usually be another group waiting to take Wash's tour. Another boost came to the little village with the building of Lock 7 in 1897. The river trade was now contributing a big part to the community's economy. The lock pit hadn't changed much over the past 100 years or so. It was closed to traffic in 2003. The following summer, after the completion of Lock 7, the Fall City made its way up the river and entered the lock gates for the first time. It was a tight fit for the big boat in the lock chamber. There was little room to spare. After the chamber was full and the upper gate opened, the big steamer put its paddle wheel into motion. This dislodged the lower gate and made it inoperable, stopping all traffic up and down the river. But worst of all, it was the height of the logging season, and the old mountain boys couldn't get their logs down to Frankfort to market. It was estimated that 800 rafts of logs were backed up from High Bridge to Valley View. Don't you know there was some harsh words spoke on the banks of the Kentucky River that night? The most exciting thing to come up the river was the showboats. Boats like the Princess, the Billy Bryant, and Dreamland. These give many people a glimpse into the outside world, a world they had never seen before. It was equivalent to the circus coming to town. Thelma Hardin told me that when she was a little girl, that they would all run to the edge of the cliff to watch the showboats come up the river. She said you could hear the calliope and see the smoke a long time before you could see the boat. For the price of 15 cents, you could go aboard one of these boats and see plays like 10 Nights in a Barroom, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Mr. Wiggs and the Cabbage Patch. Edith Carson told me that the people were dressed in the prettiest and brightest colored clothes that she had ever seen, and the stage was lit by carbide lights. I mentioned Edith Carson. The folks at High Bridge know her best for toots. Here she is shown as a young lady dressed in her Sunday best. Although she was born several years after the old promenade around the pavilion was boarded over, I got a feeling that she would have fit right in. In 1909, tragedy struck the little village of High Bridge. The railroad decided to correct a problem that had existed since the bridge was built. The bridge had been built over 30 feet too low and created a swag. A push engine had to be kept at High Bridge to push the trains up the steep grade. And then there was the bridge itself. It was never designed to carry the big engines and trains that was now going over it. It shimmied, squeaked, and popped and made all kinds of noises. It was a real thrill for the people on the passenger trains. The little depot that had brought so much pride and pleasure sat right in the path of the construction. It must have been a sad day for the folks as they watched it being destroyed. That 30-foot wall of field created all kinds of problems for the little community. Not only did it split it down the middle, leaving part of the village on one side and part on the other, it was unstable, and in the rainy seasons it washed out. At times there was 100 foot of mud on each side of the tracks. The dwellings and little stores soon moved out to other locations. A spur track was built so they could route the traffic onto the old bridge. Rail traffic was never stopped. The new bridge was simply built around the old one. The scene shown here is looking through the old bridge. The fellow in the picture is standing in the now existing road. For a little while, traffic could be run on both bridges. Shown here is a picture of both bridges. For a short time, there was talk of leaving the old bridge and using it as a walking path to make it easier for the people in Jessamine and Mercer County to cross the river. But it wasn't to be, and the old bridge was torn out. It was along about this time that the souvenirs began to show up. It seemed that everybody in High Bridge had invested in a wood-turning lathe. These souvenirs that once sold for 10 or 15 cents are worth quite a bit of money today. It wasn't until 1928 that the old field became stable enough to double track. It was at this time the top of the towers were torn off. Despite all the construction and turmoil, the tourists kept coming. Something new had come onto the scene, the touring car. People did not have to depend on the steamboats and the trains and the coaches. They could now travel when they wanted, where they wanted. A mentality that has stayed with us to this day. Shown here is a party on the ferry. They had just came down from Covington to spend a day in the park. Here's another old car scene with the bridge in the background. Note the fella in the race car with a First World War uniform. The excursion trains continue to come down from Cincinnati, picking up passengers from various stops along the way. A spur track was built in front of the park for the convenience of the tourists. They would spend a day in the park and then return home that evening. Excursion barges, as the one shown here, and excursion boats continue to run up until the late 30s. As the Second World War drew near, activity in the park seemed to fade. It may have been because of the rationing of tires and gas, or maybe the people just simply lost interest. After the war, the park did experience a small comeback, but nothing compared to its heyday. Shown here is Sam Corman and his Country Cavaliers. They would be the last band to play in the old pavilion. This was 1963. We want to thank you for watching, and we hope you've seen something here that will attract you to this very special place someday.